really a pleasure to be here this morning and talk about a subject that I think is very close to the heart of most Americans, and that's the problem of illegal drugs. There's been a number of public opinion polls, and I'm sure you've seen half a dozen of them over the past 10 years, that deal with what are the problems that Americans are most concerned about. And invariably, right at the top of the list are three items: drugs, crime, and education. And curiously enough, not only is drugs on the list by itself, it's also a major contributor to crime and education. So it's doubly important, you might say. Now, what struck me very interesting last year was the presidential election. As I watched the debates, and I tried to watch the newscasts on it and the various questions people were answering. And I was only interested really in one thing. What are they going to say about illegal drugs? Well, a bit to my surprise, the subject didn't come up at all. And as I thought back, it hadn't come up in the preceding election or the one before that. So it raises a real question in my mind, one that I'd like to address this morning, which is what's happening. Why on one hand do we have a subject area that America ranks right up at the top of the list and has done that for about 10 to 15 years, yet it never gets a mention in the political elections? Well, we're going to try and see what's happening this morning, and that's very difficult. It's difficult for three reasons. Number one, illegal drugs is an immense industry. Globally, we're talking over $500 billion a year. And number two, it's very secret because it's illegal, which makes it also very difficult to understand what's happening. And the third reason, I would say, is the manner in which the news media and the government have focused attention on it. Now, if you think back to the many specials you've seen on the drug problem, what do they focus on? Well, they focus on drug traffickers. They always have half a dozen pictures of either cocoa plants growing or marijuana growing and people coming in and cutting them down. And of course, they have a lot of attention on the sorry plight of the drug addicts. Now, these are all important areas, but they really don't tell us what is happening, and indeed, they tend to divert our attention. It's sort of like looking at a few trees in the forest, but never standing back to understand what the forest as a whole looks like. And in particular, that's what I want to do this morning. I want to focus on really three questions. Who's responsible? Who makes it work? And then the third question is, how do we really go about assessing its importance? Is this really significant or not? I think a good place to start is with some estimates that were made back in 1992 by the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, on marijuana production in the United States. Now, this was an unusual crop estimate. I hadn't seen one before, and I knew DEA pretty well, and I know they're very conservative. I've never known them to overestimate anything in my life. So I took their estimates of crop production in the United States, and I multiplied it by sort of a reasonably average value of good marijuana. And what I came up with was $30 billion. It was the cash crop of marijuana alone, domestically produced. Now that's mind-boggling when you stop to think of that magnitude. The nearest cash crop of a legal crop in the United States is around 15 billion a year. Marijuana is over twice as large. It's not unusual. About a month ago, 60 Minutes had a special in which they looked at marijuana production and its eradication in California. And the estimate they used just for California was $4 to $10 billion a year. So you can see we're really in the ballpark, and if anything, $30 billion a year is an underestimate. Now, supposing I add in the other drugs, I add in the non-domestic marijuana. Well, I've got to at least double it, more than double it. And then I start adding in the other things that are forgotten, the real big money item, cocaine, of course heroin, LSD, PCP, ecstasy, the methamphetamines. And you can see that really we're talking about is about 150 to $200 billion a year. And that's fairly easy to see. But what is even more evident that you don't need any analysis to understand is that you can't have an industry that large that's illegal without tremendous growing corruption. Corruption in the police, corruption in politics, in the financial structure, the legal structure, the court system. It's just too large. There's no other way. The other thing that's quite clear is that it's impossible unless it's politically protected, unless it's helped by our elite institutions. There's no way you can run a business that large without the witting help of the banks, the financial structure, and the investments, the politicians, and the government. It just would not be possible. There's another element here that nobody has really focused on very much that we have to bring into the equation, and that's international organized crime. And the reason that we have to bring that in is because the two are tightly integrated. In a recent study of international organized crime that was done by the top government officials from all the agencies, they concluded that the base of international organized crime was narcotics trafficking. Accordingly, you can't separate the two. They are integrated. They use the same banking system, the same facilitators. They have the same support mechanisms. They're both protected by the same people. And they have the same bosses or overlords, which again is why you have to address both of these together. And the third thing that came out in the study is the size of it, where they estimated the money laundered by international organized crime as up to and possibly even exceeding $2 trillion a year. A fantastic amount of money, something that most of us can't even begin to comprehend. Now, the report they put out was very interesting, and it had some quotes that I think tell us a big part of the story. This report was the International Crime Threat Assessment, and there was a portion of this study that was published on the internet on 15 December the year 2000. This is all the top government agencies involved. And what they said was that international criminals are attracted to global finance and trade. They are able to avoid scrutiny because of the importance to business and governments of facilitating commercial and financial transactions. Now let me translate this. What they're saying is that international organized crime and narcotics trafficking are politically protected. Now, this study was very interesting because it was focused on the international environment. So everything they're talking about applies to the world, and the implication is it applies to the rest of the world. In reality, it all applies to the United States just as well, if not more so, since narcotics use in the United States has led that in the rest of the world by about 20 to 30 years. So this study is particularly interesting. It was very well done, and I think the reason it was able to say so many things that are true about the United States is it was focused on the international environment and really not pointing fingers at the United States. But everything is true. Another quotation I pulled out of this report: most organized crime groups have been enormously successful in their illegal ventures because they have successfully corrupted those persons charged with investigating and prosecuting them. Again, we come back to the problem of political protection and indeed corruption. They have corrupted the law enforcement apparatus. And in some cases, they say some of the groups have become so successful and utterly corrupted the officials that it's no longer possible even to distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys. Another consequence that flows from this is that this industry has now exceeded the ability of the law enforcement agencies to take care of it. And of course, one of the reasons why is you can't tell the difference between the two in many countries. What makes it all work? Corruption. As it points out in this study, corruption is the indispensable tool. And of course, corruption has always been a key component of narcotics trafficking. And as we said before, who makes it work? The banks, international finance, investments, financial planning, the top law firms. You can't separate them from banking. There's an investigation of about 8 top law firms in London 3 years ago that was started because of their efforts coupled into money laundering. There was some publicity at the beginning, and then all of a sudden everything went quiet. We've never heard of any convictions or anybody going to jail. Again, how do you handle this type of a problem now when the top law firms are involved? Corruption is very key, and corruption really takes us into the problem of how do we assess how serious this problem is? How do we measure its seriousness? Here are 5 points. It's massive beyond comprehension. It's politically protected. It corrupts the leadership. It undermines the morality, and it destroys the basis of our republic. And that is the bottom line. And what destroys it is the morality of the leadership and the people, because without that, you can't have a republic. One of the people who said it most clearly 200 years ago, John Adams. The Constitution was designed for a moral and religious people. It will not work otherwise. Now, let me make a very sharp statement about this. In effect, what he's saying is the Constitution really isn't worth the cost of the paper it's written on without a moral people. As an example, in 1986, the Soviet Union came out with a new constitution. A number of experts on Russia and the Soviet Union read that constitution very carefully, and the comments I heard from several of them were, it's more democratic than our own constitution. But of course, it doesn't matter, because you don't have a legal system that's moral. You don't have a people that's moral. So in effect, it's just a paper document, which is somewhat akin to the comment Stalin made about treaties. They are like pie crusts made to be broken. David Jordan is a professor of government and former ambassador to Peru at the University of Virginia. He has made a study of looking at the effect of corruption, and corruption in terms of its effect on a republic like ours, as well as a number of other types of governments that are non-totalitarian in nature. And his conclusion, basically very simple. Corruption produces tyranny. It produces an unaccountable use of power, and that power expands as the government becomes increasingly corrupted and the people. And eventually, you are left with just the trappings of a republic. And that is the real key, in my mind, to how serious this drug problem has become. As we look around the world, one can identify, and this has been done by the government, roughly 50 countries that can already be called narco-states. It's hard to identify any states around the world that are not on that path to becoming narco-states, including the United States. Now, one of the key issues we talked about many times is political protection, and I want to go into that a little bit more detailed and use some specific examples because there's nothing that drives home a point like some concrete examples. And I've picked a variety of examples here from 2 Republican administrations. This is not a day for bashing the Republicans. I just picked them because generally here are 2 administrations which stand out because they've been identified as anti-narcotics administrations. The war on drugs started in the Nixon administration, and then the Reagan administration gave new meaning to its seriousness. So they really stand apart in that aspect. Now, I'll take the case of communist China. When President Nixon came into office, one of the first things he did is he asked the CIA to take a look at where the narcotics were coming from. And the operations department dug into it very deeply, and one of the areas they looked at was Southeast Asia. And that's where the term the Golden Triangle came from, was their report. What they concluded is that you had a triangle out of which most of the drugs flowed. And that triangle is represented by the red triangle on this map. And you can see it involved parts of Burma and Thailand and Laos, but the main contributor was China. Now that report went into the White House, and after about 9 months it was released, but something had changed. The triangle had been redrawn to the way in which it's shown as a golden triangle and skewed in such a manner as to eliminate China from the golden triangle. China was taken out of the report, and when you look at anything today that looks at the golden triangle, you'll see it includes Burma, Thailand, and Laos, but not China. Chinese drug trafficking was politically protected. We didn't want to embarrass the Chinese and have that upset the new initiative toward China, is one excuse that's been put forward. Now that's not a single example. As you recall, we had quite a battle raging in North Vietnam back in the early 70s. And one of the problems that had cropped up was an immense amount of drug use by the GIs that were over there. It was really tremendous. And a commission was formed to go over and find out what was happening. It was headed up by a Marine Corps general, General Lew Walt, extremely respected individual. And what they found was that the drugs were coming from North Vietnam and China. And they were not designed to make money, they were designed to undermine the troops. That report went into the White House, and after they looked at it, they gave General Walt an order. They said, do not discuss this with anybody. Later he remarked to a number of people that that was the most damnable order he had ever been given in his military career. And there are several more situations that took place, all of which involved the protection of China and its reputation. We have the same type of thing in Bulgaria. And this is particularly interesting because at the same time that they were starting to look at China, the CIA had a report which identified Bulgaria as a major player in narcotics trafficking. The Drug Enforcement Administration, or its predecessor, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, had a report identifying the same thing. And we even had a defector from Bulgarian intelligence who brought with him documents that said Bulgaria was officially involved as a narcotics trafficker and was money laundering also. Well, what was the United States' response? And this borders on the unbelievable, but believe me, it's true. U.S. Customs and the State Department people went to the capital of Bulgaria, Sofia, and met with their customs people. And they offered to teach Bulgarian customs the United States technique for tracking down drug traffickers so that the Bulgarians could better police their own borders. Now, I kid you not. The Bulgarians were rather amazed. They couldn't believe it. So they called a meeting with all the other East European intelligence services. Customs is part of intelligence over there. And they decided to take the United States up with its offer. And so the Bulgarians came away from the meeting and they called U.S. Customs and said, hey, sounds good to us. Come and teach us how to stop drug traffickers. And so for 10 years, the United States provided them intelligence on drug traffickers and showed them how we do it. And after 10 years, they finally figured out that, well, they didn't think they were getting too much cooperation. The intelligence was a one-way flow of information. It never affected the trafficking. And the trafficking, if anything, got worse. Well, let's shift into the Reagan administration and look at a couple more examples of narcotics trafficking. Many people will recall Mena, Arkansas, and the problem of trafficking in cocaine and money laundering that came out in the press in the mid-'80s. What had happened is some of the people that were involved in that were involved in a plane crash, and some publicity people started putting one and one together and getting two, and the conclusion was that people started recognizing that the planes that were ferrying supplies down to the freedom fighters in Nicaragua on the way back were bringing in cocaine by the tons. And of course, with all the cocaine coming into Arkansas, you also had a major money laundering operation that sprang up also. This started getting some state police investigations and files into reports that were coming in. The U.S. Attorney's Office got involved and started looking at the cases, and then all of a sudden, it just sort of dropped out of sight. And other than a few private publications, we've heard nothing. State police files were shredded, and the U.S. Attorney files were sealed. Nothing more was said about it. The CIA was blamed, and of course the CIA came up and they said, well, you know, we didn't have anything to do with it. It wasn't our people. And so then everything sort of stopped. Congress did not follow through on it. And what struck me at the time is what was happening was obvious. Of course the CIA weren't involved. They had their contract people doing it. And the question was not, were they trafficking? The question was, what did they know? What did they learn? Who did they tell? And what happened? Because those guys aren't incompetent. And this couldn't have been happening without their knowledge of it. That always puzzled me. I could never get an answer. But then, about a year ago, I found a memo. And that was an agreement that was signed by the Attorney General and the Director of the CIA in 1982. And what it did is it set forth a number of areas where it was the CIA's responsibility to report on, should they come across any of these activities taking place. And what was conspicuously absent in the list? Narcotics trafficking and money laundering. And when was it signed, as I said? 1982, which was right at the time the Nicaraguan supply operation was beginning. William von Raab was Customs Commissioner under Reagan. He is one of the extremely few people that actually tried to do something about narcotics trafficking. And when President Bush came into office, following Reagan, one of the first people he fired was William von Raab. And this is what von Raab had to say as he left office. These are all direct quotes. For the past 8 years, the State Department has objected to every effort to control foreign drug production, thus earning them the title the conscientious objectors in the war on drugs. Now, this should give you a more concrete idea, again, of what we mean by politically protected operations. The State Department is very critical because they have a dominant position in the decision-making process on overseas operations. Treasury officials have shown at best a distinct lack of interest. Justice is more concerned about protecting turf. And this last one is particularly interesting. Maybe it is time for the war on drugs to take its place as our nation's top priority, to enable it to interfere with other interests, such as banking and third world debt. Now, what's happening here? Cocaine trafficking was exploding at the time, and efforts to curtail that trafficking were suppressed. They were blocked because the cocaine was providing the Latin American countries with that cash that was needed to service the Latin American debt that, if you think back, was very critical in that time frame. Again, financial and business interests preclude the possibility of fighting a war on drugs. Now, what the State Department had to say is very interesting in terms of their description of narcotics trafficking. This came out of a statement to Congress in 1988. It's all blatantly false, but Congress never raised a fuss about it. It is still their perception. Evidence has a little bearing on their positions, which are strictly political. And look at what it says. Narcotics trafficking in Latin America, Asia, the Middle East, Europe is dominated by traffickers who are governed only by their greed and whose only ideology is the pursuit of profit. Or second, nor do we have evidence of a communist conspiracy to use drugs to undermine Western democracies or our own society in particular. Now, this sets the tone, the entire tone of the war on drugs, and is another example why there really isn't any war on drugs. Now, consider two different situations and the different way you would approach those problems if you were serious. On one hand, I can say there's just a bunch of ethnic gangs or national gangs in various countries. They're renegades, and they're out there on their own, all alone, to make money and move drugs into the United States. Situation A. Situation B. The people out in the field are basically surrogates, acting as part of a very large operation which is run by the largest intelligence services in the world, Chinese and Soviet, and who have all the assets of the state behind them to do anything from research to production to technology. You know, a world of difference between these two approaches to the problem, between these two characterizations of the problem. And you can see, if you're going to approach it as though it was this problem, that's going to be like trying to fight a lion with a fly swatter, if this is the problem. And that's the situation. Now, do we have evidence? Let's take a look at just a variety of quotations that I pulled out leading up to that time frame. You could continue them on. There's many more, that are many of which are contained in a book I'll talk about later. But just pull a few at random. Cuban ambassador stating in 1978, the goal is to hurt the United States full with drugs. Or a Cuban intelligence operator, I was ordered to load up the United States with drugs. A Nicaraguan diplomat, drugs were used as political weapons. The target was the youth of the United States. And another Cuban intelligence officer, which very good quotation, drugs are considered to be the best way to destroy the United States. By undermining the will of the American youth, the enemy is destroyed without firing one bullet. Now, these are all statements from communist officials. And you'll notice that not once is there any mention of profit. It's for political motives. It's to destroy the culture and the society. It was seeing these types of quotes and not seeing the conclusions drawn that led me into this field in the first place. I got very heavily involved in it and wrote a book called Red Cocaine. This first came out in 1990. It's been reissued about a year ago. The American Opinion Book Services carries it, as well as the publishers operates out of London and New York. Now, I want to say a few words about this book because it's really very unusual. And I'm not intending to beat my own drum on this. I really don't take the credit for it. It was produced really under a variety of very unusual circumstances and could never have done except for the presence of one individual who is not myself. I got interested, as I mentioned, in this field, looking at some of these statements that were coming out in the press and in congressional hearings at a time that my children were becoming teenagers, and that made me very concerned about the drugs. So I decided to start digging into them. My field was national security, and I somehow thought that there was a connection between national security and narcotics trafficking. And the more I looked into it, the more I saw this sort of a schizophrenic approach. You have quotations on one side that suggest a certain problem, yet you have actions and talks about the problems which are off in a different world, it seemed to me. And I wanted to find out what was happening. At that time, it turned out that I had been working with a defector from Czechoslovakia, who was the highest ranking defector ever to come to the United States. His name was Jan Sena. When I say high, I really mean high. He was a member of the Central Committee, of the legislature, of the Presidium, and of the group that gave instructions to the legislator. He was the Chief of Staff to the Minister of Defense. And he also ran the Secretariat of the Defense Council, and the Defense Council is the highest decision-making body. It's higher than the Politburo. Well, I called him up and I had lunch with him. And midway through lunch I said, Jan, have you ever heard anything about any Soviet or communist involvement in narcotics trafficking? And he looked at me for about 2 seconds and he said, of course. And he proceeded to talk nonstop for an hour. You know, the dates, the times, the places, the involvement. I knew that I'd hit the mother lode. And I knew it would take me many years to get the information out of him because he had such a tremendous memory and operated at such a high level. So I went into it. And in the process, a tremendous amount of information came out, particularly on who's responsible and who makes it happen and how it operates. In other words, where did this problem come from? Well, the information contained in here presents his story, backed up by a tremendous amount of other information and also details that support what he said after he left office, which was in 1968 when he came to the United States. It deals with the origins in the critical years of the 1950s and the 1960s, and what is so key is he provides the entire strategic framework. The decisions, the motivations, the strategy, how the whole thing operated around the world. And when you have this strategic framework, you can then follow its progression because you know where pieces of information fit in the puzzle, because he's given the whole picture of the puzzle and how it comes together. So what we want to do is focus on what is the strategic framework, how does it start? And of course, additional information can be easily assimilated once you understand the structure. And this information here contains mainly things when he was there and the following years. It follows it up through its first publication date, about 1990. And a year ago, one of the people with a considerable access and intelligence came up to me and said basically that they now know that everything that he told us that is in red cocaine is absolutely correct. Well, his story is amazing. He says it really began with China. When China became communist in 1949, when Mao Zedong nationalized the whole country there, one of the first things he did was to nationalize poppy production and turn it into a weapon to use against Japan and the United States. The Chinese, better than anybody else, knew the potential problem that drugs would produce. And indeed, we saw a tremendous jump in heroin use and drug use beginning almost immediately. Japan did too. And it was confirmed by U.S. intelligence through many channels that the source of our problem was China. As the head of narcotics at the time, Henry Anslinger, said, the mafia is not the big producers of drugs. The big drug dealer in the world is Red China. Well, the Soviets watched what China was doing. And in 1955, when Khrushchev was modernizing strategy, they took a very hard look and decided this is a good idea. We cannot afford not to be in it. So they decided to get into the game. In the next 5 years, they developed all the techniques, the strategy. They looked at the United States. They looked at U.S. intelligence to figure out where they were operating and how much they knew. And to give you an idea of where this headed, I'll take a little closer look at some schools they developed for drug traffickers. The Soviets don't do things by themselves. They use surrogates because that keeps them clean. People can't say they're behind it. So what they plan to do is recruit indigenous people around the world from the various countries, and they bring them to the Soviet Union and train them in drug trafficking. And they set up 2 schools. One was run by civilian intelligence and one was run by military intelligence. And each school would run about 20 students or so, and they would run for 3 months. And over this period of time, they taught them what drugs were, how to produce them, how to market them, how to couple into the networks, who was corrupted, where you could get political pressure to bear, how to move them into the different countries, how to communicate back with the Soviet Union, how to do counterintelligence as well as intelligence, the whole gamut of things you need to be a good drug trafficker. They taught them. Now, they started in the Soviet Union. Then Czechoslovakia was directed to take the plan and reproduce it. So they built drug trafficking schools then in Czechoslovakia, in Germany, in Bulgaria, a few years later in North Korea, in North Vietnam, in Cuba. I stopped and I counted up the number of drug traffickers they were going to produce by, say, the mid-'80s, assuming that this thing just continued to run and didn't expand anymore, which is not the case. And what I found was that by the mid-'80s, they had trained 25,000 drug traffickers that were then deployed around the world doing their thing. Most of the profits would go back to the Soviet Union, and then the drug traffickers' cut would be returned to the drug traffickers, usually about 30 to 40%. Now we come into Latin America. What happened in Latin America? And this was very key because of the role of Cuba. Now, Cuba came to the Soviet Union first trying to seek military aid and assistance. Actually, they came to Czechoslovakia. And who was their host? Jan Sena. Jan Sena, over the next 8 years, would meet 3 to 4 times a year with Raul Castro, and occasionally with Fidel. And the main topic of conversation was always the drug trafficking. Well, the Soviet Union gave instructions to Czechoslovakia during their first visit, and they said, give them all the military aid and assistance they want, and in return, have them agree to become a revolutionary center in the Western Hemisphere and establish an intelligence operation there, which the Czechs did. The next year came the first instructions: start the production of drugs and move them into the United States, which they did, with Czechoslovakia's help. Czechoslovakia knew the production by that time, and they also had excellent agent networks in Canada and Mexico, which were used to move the drugs into the United States. Having established that, another set of instructions the next year came, which was for them to infiltrate all Latin American drug networks. Again, they did that. The purpose was really to understand how they operated and what the political protection was, so that they could influence, they being the Soviets, could influence strategic control over these operations. In effect, they wanted them to run independently, tactically, but they wanted to make sure that they could control the directions the drugs flowed. Specifically, they wanted them flowing in the United States or Western Europe, and not into Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union. Once they had them infiltrated, they then also gained a lot of information on the operations of the networks in Latin America, the political protection, and the next instructions came for Cuba to set up its own operations, which it did. The first ones were in Mexico, in Panama, in Costa Rica, in Colombia, in Brazil, in Argentina, and Paraguay. these things just continued to expand. And once the Cuban ones were operating, the next instructions came for the European services to set up operations in these countries with the help of people from the Cuban operations, which were already underway. You see this thing is just mushrooming. By 1965, they had multiple drug operations that Sena was personally aware of in all of these countries. Caribbean islands, and most of the South American countries and Central American countries, and as we've seen, the ones that aren't on this list became operational areas in the years that followed. Now, having seen this growth, let's look at it in terms of the question of responsibility. Now, here's a chart of drug-dependent deaths in New York City, which is a good measure of the drugs flowing into the country and the growth in their use. And what you see is that drugs were really at almost an all-time low in the late 1940s. There had been a steady progression downward since the turn of the century. Then all of a sudden, you have this step function jump up, precisely the time China begins trafficking. And as I indicated before, we noticed the jump in usage. We started to try and find out where it was coming from, and intelligence sources identified without question that that jump came from the Chinese drugs. Japan experienced the same thing, and they also found the same information. And it sort of plateaus for another 10 years, and then about 1960, it takes off again. Surprise, surprise. Precisely at the time the Soviet operation began. I came across another set of data later on of the first use of heroin in San Francisco in the Haight-Ashbury subculture. And again, you see the same characteristic. Almost zero up through the late 1940s, a step function up when the Chinese start trafficking, and then it takes off like a rocket in 1960 when the Soviets get into the act. Now, there's an interesting thing happening in the cocaine distribution that also couples in here. In 1960, the Soviets decided that cocaine was the wave of the future through their experiments. And indeed, they thought that they could produce a pink epidemic in the United States, where pink was the combination of the red of communism and the white of cocaine. So they decided to build a dedicated cocaine trafficking network centered in Bolivia, Colombia, and Peru. They set the Germans to develop more efficient production techniques, and within 3 years, they had developed techniques so that 2 plants using their techniques could outproduce by a factor of 3 the entire production in the region that was then taking place. The trafficking began in 1967, and I ran across this curve a few years ago on the first use of cocaine, and it showed absolutely no trends up through the end of 1966. And then again, it takes off in 1967, precisely when the Soviet cocaine operation began. When we look at what's happening, and we took sort of a snapshot when Sena, the time he left the countries, we see a number of strategic targets. Originally, it was just the youth of America, but then it expanded over time, and we see military use in Vietnam, major targets, middle management in high-tech industry to sabotage it, and then the inner-city minorities and America's youth. Those became priority targets in 1967. For the inner-city minorities, they actually decided that the way to do that was to recruit blacks and Hispanics from the Caribbean, train them in Cuba, and then infiltrate them, and they could be more effective than the whites in trafficking drugs into the inner cities, because the inner cities was composed mainly of minorities. In the areas of corruption, they kept dossiers on people of power and influence who were corrupted by the drug business. And at that time, they had dossiers on over 10,000 people back then. terms of banks, they had agents in 60% of the Latin American banks, 40% of the banks in the United States and Canada. And in terms of the control and distribution of drug trafficking, by their estimates, they controlled 37% of the drugs coming into the United States and 33% of the distribution within the United States. Now it's kind of curious. Obviously they have a major role. They're all over the place, but we don't hear anything. All we hear is silence. No mention of communist drug trafficking. That raises questions in people's mind, and we have to answer that. Why such a silence? Well, it's very fortunate because there was a book published in 1997 in France, and an edition came out in our country in 1999, the Black Book of Communism. And what they did was to look at all the crimes of the communist countries. And this is not done by some people from the right. All the authors were either former communists or close fellow travelers. And they found that the crimes of communism were colossal, that they exceeded by far the crimes of Hitler. Very unusual finding. And one of the statements really tells what's happening. I want to read this in detail. They said, "The extraordinary attention paid to Hitler's crimes is entirely justified. It respects the wishes of the surviving witnesses, satisfies the needs of researchers trying to understand these events, and it reflects the desire of moral and political authorities to strengthen democratic values." But now what is interesting really comes up in contrast. But the revelations concerning communist crimes caused barely a stir. Why such a deafening silence from the academic world regarding the communist catastrophe, which touched the lives of about 1/3 of humanity on 4 continents during a period spanning 80 years? And this hasn't ended. It's still the case. The communists are accepted with open arms. We have not done anything really to try and have a Nuremberg trial, even though their crimes greatly exceed those of Hitler. Now, what's happening? Well, when the politicians are silent, why? It's because the people who fund their election campaigns, they know, don't want this information in the news media. And of course, this is largely the same financial interests, business interests, that were identified as preventing the investigation of these problems back in the International Crime Assessment. When the academics are silent, why? When the academics are silent is, number one, they're not being paid to do the studies. That means that the foundations that normally fund them, which are coupled into the globalist interests, don't want this in the media. And they know that the newspapers don't want it reported as well as that is recognized by the politicians. So what we have is we have what has been referred to in times past as an interlock. Academia, politicians, elitist globalist foundations, the news media, and centers of policy. A conspiracy of silence. This is not my term. This is a term that came out of a study done by a congressional investigation in 1953. It was headed by Carol Reese. And they were looking at the effect of tax-exempt foundations, the large ones, on policy and on education. And they had concluded that we have this enormous interlocked group of people controlled basically through the money and through the press, whose objective basically is to sell socialism to the country, to change us from a constitutional republic into a socialist democracy, and indeed to kill the public education schools, stop them from basically teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, and rather promoting socialist concepts and behavioral modification so as to accept socialism. This starts again to tell us what is happening. Well, time is getting a little bit short here, so let's sum up where we are. This is the conventional wisdom. This is what you see in the television specials on the subject and in the media. We have costs around $60 to $100 billion a year, and this includes all the costs of the war on drugs as well as health costs, unemployment costs, and everything else that's associated. It's low by about a factor of 3. Drug use and crime are diminishing, they claim. The government is serious in its war on drug efforts, but can't stop the flow, and indeed the war on drugs has failed, which is certainly not a government position, but that's the position you see communicated implicitly in the messages on television. The principal problem is demand, the people. Now, one of the things I didn't mention before, if you think back to those curves, what caused the drug use to expand? It was supply. Now, you can do everything you want to in terms of working with the addicts and the drug users. Treatment facilities galore. Spend all your money you want in that area. And it will help those people. Will it change the nature of the problem? No. Because the real problem that starts the thing, that kicks it off, is supply, not demand. Of course, we don't want a police state. That comes through, which also limits what we can do up there, they claim. And the last item is, well, what's left? We have to treat it as a public health problem, which is another way of giving up on the problem. Now, I agree 100% with the idea that we don't want a police state. But in terms of everything else on this chart, I'd say it's misleading. It justifies doing nothing except treating it really as a public health problem. Let's take a different view now, which tries to look at what the responsibilities are and the seriousness of the problem and where it came from. Drug use, crime, and costs are all grossly underestimated. Nobody wants us to understand how bad the problem really is. The drug war hasn't failed. There never has been a drug war. And the reason, it's politically protected. Illegal drugs are now worse than ever before because they're part of organized crime. The corruption that is associated both with the use and the money is destroying our culture and our republic. This is not just a United States problem. The world's elite are corrupted, and there is no reason to anticipate any changes. The reason why is very simple. The government won't act. The war on drugs is a farce. It always has been. A lot of good people working in it. But still, the nature of the problem, the assumptions, the beliefs, the perceptions are so erroneous that they're never going to do anything. And special interests, such as business and finance, dominate politics. The only hope that I can see is to stimulate a grassroots movement through the people. And indeed, until the people get aroused and start recognizing what is happening, it is impossible to expect the government to act, because the government believes that the problem is the people, and that you cannot wage war on your own people. Accordingly, it's a further reason that you won't have anything until you have the people starting to really demand action, to get concerned about it. Then there's a possibility that there might be changes in the government, but until that happens, no. What do we do? People say that there's nothing to do. Well, there's nothing that will help the problem grow more than that type of an opinion. Now, let me explain very quickly an example that shows you the effect of the people. The largest seizure of drugs ever made was not the result of DEA or the police. It was one citizen who had to make repeated calls because she wanted some suspicious activities investigated. And what did they find? They found 23 tons of cocaine. Now, there are many examples of this type of thing. But of course, the idea is don't let anybody really think they can do anything, because that then puts the people in control rather than the government. Well, what we need to do more than anything else is educate ourselves, understand how much we are being misled by the media and the government. We have to attack all those aspects of the education which promote drug use, like there are no rights or wrongs. there are no bad drugs, only bad drug users. Or, well, it's somebody else's business if they want to use drugs because it really doesn't impact me. All of those things are part of this education system that need to be destroyed in terms of our not allowing it to the extent possible. And that, of course, means challenging the claims of the drug users. One of the areas we can be very effective is promoting the use of drug use tests. Now, people tend to raise their eyebrows at that one until I tell them what happened in the military. The military had a use rate approaching 60 to 80% in units. This became unacceptable because some of those units were nuclear units. So under political pressure, they took a hold of the problem and they introduced drug use tests, random tests once a year. Everybody, not just privates, generals as well. And anybody that tests positive has one of two choices. They can go into drug treatment and get tested more often, or they can get out. And if they test positive a second time, they're thrown out. And it doesn't matter what their rank is. Well, the use went down to under 3% almost overnight. Very effective. Now, one of the big problems, of course, is where do you start? Where do you go for information? You know, the books written that are permissive about drug use, that promote drug use, that say there's no bad drugs, only drug users, they outnumber the other books by 50 to 1. And of course, your conventional wisdom is difficult to penetrate if you just pick up a book at random. So where do you go to for help? Well, in this problem, as well as many other problems, we can't stand alone. We need to be associated with some other people that we can depend on, that have done a lot of research and know where the pitfalls are. And friends, I would like to suggest that my best recommendation for such an organization is the John Birch Society. It is because of that that I joined the society. You can't stand alone. You need to be with other people who are similarly motivated, who love our country, our constitutional republic, and don't want to see it destroyed.